Hey guys, welcome back. TJ here with Dead History, and welcome to our next installment of our Declaration of Independence Signer Series, Part 2, as we take a look at Thomas Heyward Jr., a signer from South Carolina. I hope you enjoyed yesterday's Part 1 as we took a look at the early life and, of course, his education, really, of Thomas Heyward Jr., born in South Carolina at his father's plantation. And then, of course, he went over to England eventually to study, and he became very influenced by the way he saw the British basically treat the colonists or anybody that wasn't born in Britain. So it really changed his whole outlook on things. So very interesting stuff about the early life of Thomas Heyward Jr. Now today, in this part 2, we're going to get into some very interesting details, not only about him signing the Declaration of Independence, of course, but about his relationship with slavery and lots of interesting facts regarding and surrounding that. So, I am flying solo for the audio here. Without further ado, let's jump right into it. Declaration of Independence Signer Series Part 2, Thomas Heyward Jr. of South Carolina. Here we go. So, as we had touched on in Part 1, Thomas Heyward Jr. was an American founding father, lawyer, jurist, and politician. He was active politically during the Revolutionary era, and as a member of the Continental Congress representing South Carolina, he signed the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation. Thomas Heyward Jr.'s imprisonment in Florida by the British for nearly a year and the loss of a considerable number of slaves led to his being widely proclaimed a martyr of the Revolution. Thomas Heyward Jr. is one of two signers, along with Francis Hopkinson of New Jersey, who wrote a song available for download from iTunes. Well, maybe. The issue is not whether MP3s of 18th century ditties are available online. They are in droves. The real question is whether Thomas Heyward Jr., a man once described as possessing elegant poetical genius, really wrote the song ascribed to him. No one knows for sure, but the story tugs at the heartstrings. Thomas Heyward Jr. worked on the committee that was drafting the new Constitution for South Carolina, but his fellow citizens needed a voice in Congress. Heyward, who was then about 30, was sent to Philadelphia with 3 other young dandies, Edward Rutledge, Arthur Middleton, and Thomas Lynch Jr. Heyward was the second oldest in the group. He arrived in Congress and stood out as being a firm Republican of good education and most amiable manners. Though the young men had not been instructed to vote for independence, they quickly grasped that if the 13 colonies did not present a unified front, the Union of States could not function. On July 2nd, they reversed their stance and sided with the other colonies. Thomas Heyward, like the others, voted for and signed the Declaration. In 1778, his last year in Congress, he signed the Articles of Confederation as well. Now, it doesn't mean that he signed the Declaration in 1778. His last year in Congress is 1778, and he also signed the Articles of Confederation, so just not to get it confused, of course. The war brought adversity to Heyward's life. He served as a captain in the militia, and in 1779 he was wounded in an attack on Port Royal Island north of Hilton Head on the South Carolina coast. The next year, the British ransacked Whitehall Plantation, leading away his slaves, many of whom were sold to Jamaican sugar plantations. Heyward would recover some of them, but about 130 slaves were lost for good. Heyward himself was captured in May of 1780 when the British attacked Charleston. At first, he was paroled, but the authorities later changed their minds. He was rearrested and imprisoned, first on a prison ship and then in St. Augustine, Florida. His fellow prisoners included Rutledge and Middleton. While imprisoned, Heyward occupied his mind by writing songs. Imagine then that the sun begins to rise off the coast of Florida on the morning of July 4th of 1781. Unshaven and dressed in rags, Heyward and his fellow signers stand to face the new day on the 5th anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. As the British guards try to silence them, they stand on crude bunks and belt out a tune Heyward has crafted in prison. The melody is taken from God Save the King, the British National Anthem. But the words have been changed to something far more American. One version of the song, entitled God Save the 13 States, begins, God save the 13 states, long rule the United States. God save our states, make us victorious, happy and glorious. No tyrants over us, God save our states. Imagine what a poignant Les Mis moment that would have been. Unfortunately, recent evidence suggests that their conditions under house arrest were fairly decent. No rags to be found. And in fact, this folk song, which was popular in the United States during this period, has been attributed to a number of other authors. So until someone unearths a scrap of lyrics in Heyward's handwriting, signed and notarized, its true authorship may never be known. His incarceration lasted until July of 1781, when he, along with Rutledge and Middleton, was released as part of a prisoner exchange. Though he served as a judge and state legislator later in life, Heyward mostly retired from politics and devoted himself to rebuilding Whitehall Plantation and growing his crops. He lived longer than any other South Carolina signer, dying in 1809 at age 63. He was buried at his father's estate, Old House. The plantation was destroyed during the Civil War and lies in a marshy ruins today, but the grave of the signer, surrounded by a low wall of lichen-covered bricks, is still accessible down a lonely drive lined with oak trees. Perhaps it's fitting that the signer-songwriter's many descendants include Dubois Heyward, the author of the novel that became the basis for the opera Porgy and Bess. Thomas Heyward was among the earliest in South Carolina who resisted the oppressive measures of the home government. And from the passage of the Stamp Act to the Battle of Lexington, he promoted the Patriot cause, ever repudiating the degrading terms of conciliation, absolute submission, which the British government demanded. The openness and manly frankness with which he espoused the Patriot cause made him a leader in the revolutionary movements in that province. He was placed in the first General Assembly that organized after the abdication of the colonial governor, and he was appointed a member of the first Committee of Safety there. At the age of 29, he was elected to fill the vacancy of John Rutledge as delegate to the Second Continental Congress in early 1776, in time to enter upon the lengthy discussion of American independence. He warmly supported Richard Henry Lee's motion for absolution from British rule, and, much to his royalist father's displeasure, Thomas joyfully voted for independence on July 4th and signed the famous parchment along with the other South Carolina delegates on August 2nd of 1776, a few days after his 30th birthday. His father admonished him and said that the British likely would hang him for this act. Happily for the family relationship, Heyward blood was thicker than politics, and the two men reconciled and were close as father and son before the father's death the next year. Thomas Heyward left political life upon his father's death to come home and help with the family plantations. But he was a signer of the American Articles of Confederation on behalf of South Carolina on July 9th of 1778. He also had a home in Charleston, where he accepted a judgeship of the criminal courts of the new government. Here he was called on to preside at the trial and condemnation of several persons charged with treason with the British Army, which at that time was attacking the city of Charleston. The trial of these persons was followed by their execution, which took place by hanging within view of the enemy, in which served to render the judge most obnoxious to the British. Heyward, like his fellow signer Edward Rutledge, accepted a commission in the South Carolina militia and served as a captain of artillery. He received a gunshot wound in the 1779 battle where General Moultrie defeated the British at Beaufort, I believe it's Beaufort, in South Carolina, and this scarred him for life. During the siege and capture of the city of Charleston by General Clinton and the British forces in 1780, Judge Heyward had command of a battalion and was seized as a prisoner of war for being a leader of the revolution. He, Rutledge, and several others were taken to the British fort at St. Augustine, Florida, and held until the end of the war in 1781. During his imprisonment, he wrote a parody on God Save the King, the British National Anthem, of patriotic verses which became known as God Save the 13 States, a rendition that soon echoed from Georgia to New Hampshire. Also during this time, he suffered greatly in respect to his property. The British injured his plantations, and a band of marauders, his slaves, seized and carried away, some of which were afterwards recovered. At the war's end, Judge Heyward and some fellow prisoners were transported by ship to Philadelphia, and he narrowly escaped death en route from an accident where he fell overboard, but survived by holding on to the ship's rudder until assisted. After the war, he returned to Charleston, served as associate law judge for South Carolina, and served South Carolina again as a delegate to adopt the state constitution in 1790. Heyward turned his attention to agriculture and worked to restore the family plantations. He was one of the founders of the South Carolina Agricultural Society, and in 1785, he became its first president. In 1799, he withdrew entirely from public life. The Heyward family was one of only a few of our colonial families to whom a patent for arms was issued directly. This patent, dated December 1st of 1768, from the Herald's College, London, grants 11-326. It was issued to Thomas Heyward Jr. while a student at Middle Temple, London. The arms and crest were issued to his father, Daniel Heyward. Judge Heyward was married twice, at age 26 and at age 40, and each wife was named Elizabeth. The first Elizabeth was the daughter of Colonel John and Sarah Gibbs Matthews, born in 1753, and whose brother John was governor of South Carolina. She died in childbirth in 1782 in Philadelphia, where she had gone to be with him upon his release as prisoner of war. She is buried there in St. Peter's Episcopal Churchyard. They had 6 children, but only one son, Daniel, survived childhood. The second Elizabeth, from 1769 to 1833, daughter of Colonel Thomas and Mary Elliott Savage of Charleston, South Carolina, had 3 children to live to adulthood: Thomas, William, and Elizabeth. There are a number of descendants today in the 21st century surviving his 4 children. Notable descendants include Duncan Clinch Heyward, twice elected governor of South Carolina, and 1937 published author of Seed of Madagascar, which relates the story of his rice-planting family, and Dubois Heyward, whose 1920s novel and later stage play, Porgy, portrayed blacks without condensation and was transformed by George Gershwin into the popular opera Porgy and Bess, an American musical masterpiece. The signer built a beautiful plantation home, which he called Whitehall, and lived also in 2 different homes in Charleston. When President George Washington made his triumphal tour of the southern states in 1791, the city of Charleston rented the home of Thomas Heyward Jr. for the use of the president during his week's visit. That home, at 87 Church Street in the downtown Charleston Historic District, is known today as the Heyward Washington House. It is owned by the Charleston Museum and is open for public touring, furnished with Heyward Family and other period furniture. President Washington also stopped on his way to Savannah to spend a night at Whitehall with Judge and Mrs. Heyward, and there was a great party. Whitehall was a large and beautiful mansion overlooking the marshes on Hazard's Creek, a tributary of Broad River which flows to the ocean. This home burned to the ground in the latter 1800s. No pictures survived of the home. Only a few bricks and tabby remain today on the low bluff, along with the grand entrance lane of stately live oaks and moss stretching perhaps a quarter mile to the brick gates at the road. Thomas Heyward Jr. died on April 17th of 1809 at age 63 and was buried next to his father in the family cemetery at Old House, his father's property near Whitehall on the same marshy creek. This cemetery is now a state-designated historic site on South Carolina Route 336 in Jasper County, the entrance to which is identified by a roadside historical marker. The state of South Carolina has also marked his grave with a memorial stone and a bust of the signer. Heyward was apparently well regarded by his peers. Dr. Benjamin Rush, a signer from Pennsylvania and a prominent Philadelphia physician and medical teacher, had this to say about him. He was a firm Republican of good education and most amicable manners. He possessed an elegant political genius, which he sometimes exercised with success upon the various events of the war. Thomas Heyward now lies in the old family cemetery, his burial place marked by both its original monument and a commemorative column erected later by the state of South Carolina. The old house has long been gone, but the stately moss-draped oaks must all have been there in Heyward's times. In the heat of a summer day, one can still imagine the sights and sounds of the old plantation, but everything is quiet now. The other Heyward house is different. It is located in downtown Charleston, where the pace is brisk and the people busy. The tranquility of Old House and the activity of the city reflected closely the contrasts of Thomas Heyward's life. Part of it was spent in the quiet world of the plantation, the library, and the study. But another part of it was spent amid the turmoil of debate and the clash of battle. Like the other 3 South Carolina signers, Heyward studied law in England. Not only was this considered good professional training, but residence in the mother country was a distinct status symbol among South Carolina aristocrats. At 25 years old, Heyward was back in Carolina, engaged in legal practice. At 26, he was a member of the Provincial Assembly. In 1776, he served on the Committee of 11, drafting a constitution for the state of South Carolina. His congressional years preceded a period of military service that ended in 1780. At that time, he, Edward Rutledge, and Arthur Middleton were captured at Charleston and sent to St. Augustine as British prisoners. While in the Castillo di San Marco, Heyward composed a parody of God Save the King, which he called God Save the States. It is unlikely that its cleverness particularly impressed his captors. During his imprisonment, Heyward's estate was plundered by the British, but an even more harrowing ordeal occurred on his way home after being released. Somehow he fell overboard and escaped drowning only by hanging onto the rudder until he could be hauled safely aboard. Heyward founded the South Carolina Agricultural Society in 1785, and his last public involvement was probably at the convention of 1790 that wrote a new state constitution. The cycle ended in 1809, where it had begun in 1746, and Thomas Heyward returned to the great oaks he had once known so well. Thomas Heyward attended a provincial congress at Charleston on January 11th of 1775, which practically took over the functions of government. He was chosen by this Congress as one of the 13 members of the Council of Safety. He was elected to the Second Provincial Congress, which met November 1st of 1775, and was chosen as one of their delegates in their second session beginning February 1st of 1776. He served on a committee of 11 to prepare a constitution for South Carolina, which was adopted on March 26th of 1776. Heyward was chosen as one of the 4 delegates from South Carolina to the Second Continental Congress. He voted in favor of independence on July 2nd and signed the Declaration of Independence on August 2nd of 1776. He was again elected to the Continental Congress on January 10th of 1777 and served to the end of 1778. On November 15th of 1777, he signed the Articles of Confederation. He returned to South Carolina and on July 9th of 1778 became a judge of the Court of Common Pleas and was one of the ratifying officers of the Articles of Confederation. He was also elected to the South Carolina House of Representatives. Thomas Heyward Jr. was a member of the South Carolina militia and captain of a battalion of artillery in Charleston. His battalion participated in General Moultrie's defeat of the British on February 4th of 1779 on Port Royal Island, where he was wounded. He took part in the defense of Charleston, and upon the fall of the city on May 12th of 1780, he was paroled as a prisoner of war. Soon his parole was recalled. He was sent to St. Augustine, Florida, and was held until exchanged in July of 1781. While Heyward was confined in St. Augustine, the British plundered his Whitehall plantation and carried off all his slaves. They were sold to sugar planters in Jamaica. He recovered some, but about 130, valued at $50,000, were lost in addition to other property. Heyward resumed his seat on the bench in 1782 and was actively engaged in judicial duties until 1789. In 1790, he assisted in framing the Constitution of the state of South Carolina. He then resigned and turned his attention to agriculture, having been one of the founders of the Agricultural Society of South Carolina in 1785 and became its first president. The Heyward family was one of only a few to whom a patent for arms was issued directly to our colonial families. The patent, dated December 1st of 1768 from the Herald's College, London, I already told you this, was issued to Thomas Heyward Jr. while a student. Was created and granted to his father, Daniel Heyward. Thomas Heyward Jr. died on April 17th of 1809 and was buried near his father in the family graveyard at Old House in St. Luke's Parish, Jasper County, South Carolina. In 1920, the General Assembly of South Carolina appropriated $2,500 for a monument 9 feet high, upon which was mounted a bronze bust of the signer. The bust is no longer on the monument. And some genealogy for him. Captain Thomas Heyward Jr., Esquire, was the son of Daniel and Mary Miles Heyward. He was born on July 28th of 1746 at Old House. He was called Thomas Jr. because his father's brother was also Thomas. He married first on April 20th of 1773 at Charleston, Elizabeth Matthews, and he married his second wife on May 4th of 1786 at Charleston, Elizabeth Savage. He had 1 surviving child by his first wife and 3 by his second. His children were, by his first wife, Daniel, Marie, Thomas, John, Thomas again, and by his second wife, Thomas yet again, James, and Eliza. His first wife, Elizabeth Matthews, died on August 16th of 1782 in Philadelphia, where she had gone to meet him upon his release from imprisonment at St. Augustine in Florida. She's actually buried in St. Peter's Churchyard in Philadelphia. So she's buried, as I said, in St. Peter's Churchyard in Philadelphia. It's actually the same cemetery that George Mifflin Dallas, Vice President George Mifflin Dallas, is buried in Philadelphia. The photos you're seeing on your screen now, that is the churchyard. That's the cemetery there. I don't know. I mean, she could be, her gravesite and headstone could be in one of these pictures, but I don't know. I've never specifically gone and tried to find her. Plus, there's no information online about where her grave specifically is. So it may even be where it's like you would have to contact the church to try to find out if they even know specifically. So there you go. So then his second wife, Thomas Heyward's second wife, Elizabeth Savage, was the daughter of Colonel Thomas and Mary Elliott Savage of Charleston, South Carolina. Thomas Savage's will was dated February 22nd of 1786, probated June 10th of 1786, and he left all his estate to his wife, Mary Elliott, and Mary Elliott Savage left a will dated October 31st of 1786, probated July 28th of 1789, and she named Elizabeth, under 21 years, wife of Thomas Heyward Jr. She stated her mother was Elizabeth Butler of Georgia, deceased, who left a will dated November 21st of 1775, leaving her children, when of age, land on Great Ogeechee River, called Back Plantation. Another source here, of course, in 1775, he was elected a delegate to the Second Continental Congress in place of John Rutledge, who was called home to take measure against an anticipated invasion by the British. Nevertheless, Heyward declined, explaining that he believed he was too young. However, he remained active in the provincial Congress and was elected again as a delegate to Congress during 1776, which he accepted. He was then propelled into the midst of those patriots who pledged their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor in the course of supporting, adopting, and signing the Declaration of Independence. As a South Carolinian, Heyward was hesitant at first regarding the Declaration due to differences, including the topic of slavery. However, after holding back support on July 1st, he relented and voted in the affirmative in the crucial unanimous vote on July 2nd. Independence was formally adopted on July 4th of 1776. Heyward also signed the parchment document during August and remained with Congress when it fled to Baltimore to evade capture by the British Army that threatened Philadelphia. Although General Washington terminated the threat with the victory at Trenton during the latter part of 1776, Congress remained in Baltimore. On January 3rd, Heyward was appointed to a committee of 3, along with Abraham Clark and Francis Lightfoot Lee, charged with amending the Articles of War. On the 31st, he was appointed to a committee delegated to draw up a schedule of honors due to the late General Joseph Warren, who was slain at Bunker Hill, and to the late General Hugh Mercer, who was killed at Princeton on January 12th of 1777. Heyward was appointed on March 19th as one of 3 men charged with investigating the conditions of the French officers serving in the Continental Army. Congress had resolved that all applications by those officers were to be referred to the committee. During 1777, Thomas's father, Colonel Daniel Heyward, succumbed, leaving Thomas to oversee the family estate. That year in 1777, Congress adopted the Articles of Confederation on November 15th. The Articles were afterwards sent to each state for ratification, and on March 1st of 1781, the Articles became effective. The entry in the journals of the Continental Congress for that day records the acceptance of the ratification and the accompanying signatures. The Articles dictated U.S. law, specified the powers and responsibilities of the federal government, and underscored its limitations. Thomas Heyward's congressional career closed during 1778, but not his conviction and commitment to the cause of liberty. By war's end, he paid dearly for his convictions. Heyward returned to South Carolina during 1778 and assumed a position as a judge, criminal and civil courts, but soon he was fighting in the military. He was with the forces under General William Moultrie that fought and repelled the British under Major Gardner at Port Royal Island on February 3rd of 1779. Heyward, a captain at the time, was wounded during the fighting. Edward Rutledge, another signer of the Declaration, also fought at that battle, a fight that caused the British to postpone their invasion. Heyward was also with the military at Charleston. One of Heyward's colleagues, Lyman Hall, had been in Charleston, but he fled for New England before the city fell during May of 1780. Heyward, badly wounded and left with an indelible scar, was seized and transported to Florida to be imprisoned in St. Augustine. He was not the only signer snagged by the British at Charleston. Edward Rutledge and Arthur Middleton were also captured, and Lyman Hall barely escaped. Hall had been in Georgia and fled to South Carolina when the British invaded there. However, he departed Charleston and made it to New England, depriving the British of his company. Rutledge and Middleton, similarly to Heyward, received extremely harsh treatment. The British, while in South Carolina, devastated Heyward's estate and confiscated his slaves, most of whom were afterward transported to Jamaica. He survived his time in captivity and was released from his dungeon during July of 1781. During the voyage to Philadelphia, by accident, Heyward fell overboard, but he was able to grasp the rudder of the ship until he was rescued. While a prisoner, Heyward used his literary skills to modify the British National Anthem by changing the lyrics to suit his pleasure and changing the title from God Save the King to God Save the 13 States. His songwriting seemed quite successful, as the patriotic ripoff tune spread rapidly through the colonies. The feeling of exhilaration for Heyward was dimmed when he saw his estate in absolute ruins, but by the following year, things turned worse when his wife Elizabeth succumbed. Also in 1782, Heyward resumed his judgeship, a position he retained until 1789. He became a member of the state legislature and served 2 terms. During 1790, Heyward participated in the establishment of the Constitution of South Carolina. Several years after the death of his first wife, he remarried, taking Elizabeth Savage as his second wife. During 1794, Heyward sold his house in Charleston, but retained his plantation. Thomas Heyward Jr., assigned Jr. by his father, Daniel, to distinguish him from his uncle Thomas, his father's brother. He succumbed on March 6th of 1809 at age 62 while at Whitehall Plantation. Thomas Heyward was interred in the family cemetery at the Old House Plantation. Scant information remains regarding the children from both of his marriages, but it is known that he was survived by his wife Elizabeth and 4 children. Daniel married Anne Sarah Trezevant, the parents of Elizabeth, who married Captain James Hamilton in the U.S. Army and Brigadier General in the militia. Hamilton later became governor of South Carolina and afterward was engaged for a while as a diplomat of the Republic of Texas before Texas was admitted to the Union. Later, during 1857, he was lost at sea when a collision occurred between the vessels Appaloosa and the Galveston in the Gulf of Mexico off Texas. The other surviving children from his second marriage were Thomas, who married Anna Elizabeth Cuthbert, the daughter of General John A. Cuthbert of Bethel; James Hamilton Heyward, who married Decima Shubrick, the sister of William Branford Shubrick, Rear Admiral in the U.S. Navy; and Elizabeth, who married Henry Middleton Parker. The Heyward House in Charleston, later known as the Heyward Washington House, still stands. During 1791, when President George Washington traveled to Charleston, he stayed at the townhouse. Some sources differ on the date of the death of Thomas Heyward Jr. However, most reliable sources, including Dwight Goodrich, Lossing, and Sanderson's Lives of the Signers, each supply March of 1809. Another source from the 19th century, Sages and Heroes of the American Revolution by Judson and the National Park System, also lists his death as occurring March of 1809. Harper's Encyclopedia of U.S. History by Lossing, 1906, lists the date as March 6th of 1809. In 1775, Mr. Heyward was elected to supply a vacancy in Congress occasioned by the recall of the distinguished John Rutledge, whose presence was required at home to assist in defending the state against a threatened invasion. This honor, owing to his peculiar modesty, he at first declined. He was, however, at length induced to enter upon the duties of his appointment and arrived in Philadelphia in season to attend upon the discussion of the great question of American independence. In the year 1778, Mr. Heyward was appointed a judge of the criminal courts of the new government. A sense of duty alone prompted him to accept of this arduous and responsible station. Soon after his elevation to the bench, he was called to the painful duty of presiding at the trial and condemnation of several persons charged with a treasonable correspondence with the British Army, which at that time was in the vicinity of Charleston. The condemnation of these persons was followed by their execution, which took place within view of the enemy, and which served to render the judge most obnoxious to the British. In the spring of 1780, the city of Charleston was besieged by General Clinton and was taken possession by him on the 12th of May. Judge Heyward at this time had command of a battalion. On the reduction of the place, he became a prisoner of war. As he had been one of the leaders of the revolution, he with several others who had acted a similarly distinguished part were transported to St. Augustine, while the other prisoners were confined on board some prison ships in the harbor of Charleston. During his absence, he suffered greatly in respect to his property, his plantation being much injured by a party of marauders, and all his slaves seized and carried away. Some of his slaves were afterwards reclaimed, but 130 were finally lost, being transported, as was supposed, for the benefit of the sugar planters on the island of Jamaica. Judge Heyward and his fellow prisoners at St. Augustine at length had leave to return to Philadelphia. On his passage thither, he narrowly escaped a watery grave. By some accident he fell overboard, but fortunately kept himself from sinking by holding to the rudder of the ship until assistance could be rendered to him. On returning to Carolina, he resumed his judicial duties, in the exercise of which he continued till 1798. During this interval, he acted as a member of a convention for forming the state constitution in 1790. In the following year, he retired from all public labors and cares, except those which were attached to his commission as judge. Mr. Heyward was twice married. In 1773 to a Miss Matthews, a lady of affectionate disposition and great personal charms. Sometime after her death, he was again connected in marriage with a Miss Savage. By both of these wives he had children, the history of whom, however, we have not ascertained. Judge Heyward died in March of 1809 in the 64th year of his age. Although we have been able to collect but few incidents in the life of Thomas Heyward, our readers may be assured that he was among the most estimable of the men who lived in his time, and one of the most firm, honest, intelligent, and fearless who embarked in the Revolution. He was characterized for sound judgment and an ardent disposition. Possessing such a character, he naturally acquired and was justly entitled to the confidence and esteem of his fellow citizens. It was happy for America, happy for the cause of freedom, that the God of heaven raised up such a generation of men at a time when the civil and religious liberties of the country demanded their wisdom, fortitude, and patriotism, and at a time too when, without their existence and without their exalted virtues, the world had never seen so brilliant an exhibition of political liberty, order, and peace as is presented in the government of Republican America. So I wanted to read some more things about Heyward. We know he was a planter, lawyer, judge, politician, and soldier, founding father. He was among the last to sign the Declaration of Independence on August 2nd. Captain of artillery. He, along with over 5,000 American troops, would be taken prisoner when Charleston was surrendered to the British. We know all this. And even if granting leeway for the historical period, one must wonder the level of Heyward's hypocrisy by adding his name to a document that proclaimed all men are created equal. while his family was one of the largest slaveholder in America. Actually, his family was the largest slaveholder in America. Hundreds of slaves worked on 16 plantations spread over approximately 26,000 acres. Heyward's imprisonment and the confiscation of some of his slaves, reported to be 130, led to his being widely proclaimed a martyr to the revolution after the war. A new nation that just won its fight for liberty and largely still immune to the horrors of slavery, which continued to imprison a quarter of its population, was not ready to look in the mirror and see what was truly in their hearts. According to Richard Ellis, direct descendant of William, brother to Thomas Heyward Jr., the Heywards were originally from Little Eaton, England, and decided to come to the colonies in 1662. The original family members in the colonies were Daniel and Thomas Heyward. Thomas Heyward, great-grandfather of Heyward Jr., died soon after marriage, and his only son, Thomas Heyward, Heyward Jr.'s grandfather, was sent to England to live with his uncle. There, the grandfather, Thomas Heyward, married and had children before returning to America in 1700 and settling in the Charleston area on the peninsula. He participated in the Yamasee Native American War in 1715, or Yamasee. I have to see how you pronounce it. And for that, he was granted 500 acres, the beginnings of the Heywards' vast land holdings. And it's Yamasee, I believe. Yamasee Native American War. The first home was a modest log cabin. It was replaced by a wooden structure called the Old House in what is present-day Jasper County, South Carolina. This in turn was replaced with an elegant manor house. The mansion at Whitehall Plantation, the location present-day Uhaw Creek, Grahamville, St. Luke's Parish, Jasper County, was within a stone's throw of Old House. It was built between 1771 and 1775 and stood 3 stories high. It was constructed on a tabby foundation which consisted of oyster shells, bricks, and mortar. The foundations of Whitehall are all that remain. Part of the property burned in 1870 after having survived Sherman's march during the Civil War. The remainder of the house collapsed before 1964, leaving only the foundation standing. Heyward Jr.'s grandfather died in 1736, leaving 3 sons, Daniel, Thomas, and the youngest, John. All 3 would have lived to adulthood. Thomas Heyward Jr., born in 1746 at his family's plantation in St. Luke's Parish, was the eldest son of wealthy rice planter Daniel Heyward and Mary Miles. He would have 4 brothers and a sister, all living to adulthood, with Benjamin, the youngest, dying at age 20. Thomas added the junior to his name to distinguish himself from his uncle Thomas Heyward. Both Heyward's grandfather and father were studious businessmen and farmers. Over the years, the family's land holdings and wealth expanded exponentially. From early on, the child Heyward received the finest tutoring money could buy. And then it goes on to just tell more about, of course, his life and things we already know. Not going to read all that, but I found another very interesting article about him. So this article is really long. I'm actually going to show you here on the screen pictures of it, believe it or not. It really covers the same stuff we've already covered. So I'm not going to, it's very long. I'm not going to read it, verbatim. It just talks about his time, of course, growing up. A little more in-depth kind of thing about different things about what he did. You guys can see the name of it if you ever want to look it up and read it for yourselves. It's just really long. It would make this video just incredibly long for really no reason, to be honest. But it does talk a little bit about his slaves and how, how he basically definitely owned slaves on his Whitehall plantation. Definitely a slave owner. How at his Whitehall estate, he found the slave quarters empty and the fields overgrown with weeds when he came back after being captured. The British sold the slaves to sugar planters in Jamaica. Years of earnest effort passed before Whitehall could be restored to life and prosperity. So it talks about all that kind of thing. Talks about how, the Daughters of the American Revolution, obviously did commemoration stuff for him. Just interesting stuff, but nothing I'm going to read verbatim. And as I said, Heyward was married twice. We know all that, of course. Second wife, they had children. First wife, she died in childbirth. They had 6 children, but only one son. Daniel survived childhood. Second wife, they had 3 children who lived to adulthood. Notable descendants include Du Bois Heyward, whose novel and later stage play, Porgy, portrayed black African Americans and was transformed by George Gershwin into Porgy and Bess, an American opera that achieved both credit as a musical masterpiece and criticism for pervasive racism. In addition to his wives, Thomas Heyward Jr. impregnated at least one of the women he enslaved, making him the grandfather of Thomas E. Miller, one of only 5 African Americans elected to Congress from the South in the 1890s. And at one time, the Heyward family had the largest slaveholding in the United States. Now, this is interesting, something I found. U.S. Congressman Representative Thomas Miller, Heyward's African American grandson, wiped away some of his grandfather's stain of slavery. I shall not be muffled here. I am in part the representative of those whose rights are denied, of those who are slandered by the press, and I deem it my supreme duty to raise my voice, though feebly, in their defense. Representative Thomas Miller, U.S. Congress, African American, speaking on the House floor in the 1890s. One of Heyward's grandsons would become a South Carolina representative to the U.S. Congress, Representative Thomas Miller, from 1852 to 1938 is when he lived. Miller's grandfather, Thomas Heyward Jr., was a true man of his times. Heyward often adhered to the practice of large slaveholding masters, such as Thomas Jefferson, who impregnated their slaves. One such female slave who fell prey to Heyward would give birth to a fair-skinned mulatto. That child would become the mother of the United States Representative Thomas Miller, born as a slave in 1852, whose father, so too, was a wealthy white planter. The child Miller was taken from the mother by the wealthy white father's family and given to be raised by another couple, Richard and Mary Farabee Miller, former slaves who had been freed by 1850. Miller would grow up to become a successful lawyer and one of a generation of 19th century Republican African American lawmakers from the post-Reconstruction era to serve in Congress in the Civil War's aftermath. One of only 5 African Americans elected to Congress from the South in the 1890s. As the systemic disfranchisement of the Jim Crow era suppressed black voting, no African Americans were elected from the South until 1972, well after passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In the face of the growing KKK and racial violence, Miller stood firm on the House floor, a champion for minority rights, until the South Carolina Supreme Court invalidated his election ballots. His successful law practice continued his efforts for humanity until his death in 1938. Truly a great man of his time. Porgy and Bess, we know that, of course, was very interesting. Born of an old influential white family in Charleston, South Carolina, Du Bois Heyward drew his inspiration from Porgy through news stories and from observations of African American culture. The novel tells the story of Porgy, a crippled street beggar living in the black tenements of Charleston, South Carolina in the 1920s. Very, very interesting stuff. So you know what, guys? I think that's going to do it. You know, I would love to sit here and read the entire article, that long article I found. I'm actually probably going to be showing you guys some maps of the land, just to kind of give you an idea. I'm sending to you here within a rough map of the property surrounding the old Thomas Heyward tomb site. I've taken the liberty of shading in the property owned by the county in a light green color, but it's not colored, so you can kind of see a little bit of like the property of where like Old House and Whitehall was with the map on the screen. And you know, just it's an interesting article. Like I said, I showed it earlier on the screen if you want to look it up. It goes into a little more depth and detail about like some people that Heyward was involved with when it came to the military. But again, it's just repeating a lot of the same information that I've already gone over, so I'm not going to read it verbatim. It would add probably 25 minutes to this video, so which is kind of unnecessary. So that's pretty much it. Thomas Heyward Jr., signer from South Carolina, the Heyward family, the largest slaveholders in America during the time, and Thomas Heyward Jr., the grandfather, at least what seems to be the grandfather of Thomas Miller, a U.S. congressman back in the 1890s. So really interesting stuff, really cool stuff. There is bonus footage, so stay tuned. You're going to see my visit to the gravesite and the remnants of Old House, the property there. Can't wait to show you that. You're going to see my visit to the Heyward, Washington house. I never went inside, but you'll see pictures of me from when I stopped there and saw the house. So stay tuned for that stuff and maybe even a little more in bonus footage coming up. I hope you enjoyed this look at Thomas Heyward Jr. I really enjoyed doing this video. And stay tuned for next week. We're going to take a look at our next South Carolina signer. And, of course, there's 2 more to cover from South Carolina, 4 total. So, looking forward to it. Thank you so much, guys, for all the support, the likes, the comments, all of it, questions. Keep it all coming. Thank you so very much. And stay tuned for that bonus footage. And we will see you next week. Bye-bye, guys. This isn't an old plantation driveway. I don't know what is. Look at this. This doesn't get much southern plantation looking than this. Absolutely beautiful and cool. Really, really neat.